Next, speaking, Dr. Christopher Hamilton, who is also a geologist and an assistant professor at the University of Arizona, Department of Planetary Sciences. He's no stranger to Iceland. He's conducted important research here before, and he contributed to Iceland's successful proposal to have the Vatnajökull National Park inscribed as a UNESCO World Heritage Site. And he's currently hosted by the University of Iceland, also by the Institute of Earth Sciences, like Sarah. And he's came to study two past lava eruptions in Holuhraun and Laki, but he kind of hit an extra jackpot with the current eruption right here in our backyard. You may have seen Chris on CNN and the Icelandic media and elsewhere, where he has been consulted as an expert. So, Chris, we'd love to hear what you've been doing and what your plans are continuing in.
Okay, great, thank you. Just going to start sharing the screen. And can people see this okay?
Yep.
Great. Okay. So overall, in the presentation, to give you an overview of what I've been working on, yeah, I was just making sure that it wasn't cut off. I'm going to focus a little bit less on the specific science results. If people are interested, I'm happy to chat about them in more detail. I'll highlight some of the key findings of some of the papers we've been working on, but I wanted to give you an overview of what had been planned and in practice what we're able to do so far. So shown here in the background is part of the vent region, Bálgur, for the Holuhraun eruption site, which was the last very large eruption in Iceland. It occurred in 2014 and 2015 in a relatively inaccessible part of the highland near Askja. I've been fortunate to have been brought out as part of the early monitoring effort for that and had the chance to see it active. And for the 5 or so years following the eruption, made annual pilgrimages to be able to study that as both a geological phenomenon representative of large effusive volcanism or the formation of lava flows in Iceland, but also as an analog for Mars as well. And I'm just going to start a timer to make sure that we stay on track. So this eruption had been the largest eruption in Iceland since the Laki event, which was in 1783 to 1784. That's my favorite of all eruptions in Iceland. Holuhraun has been very interesting. It was very easy to study in a lot of ways because the lava was emplaced on a very smooth and flat terrain. And that stands in sharp contrast to the new eruption in Iceland, which is confined by relatively high-standing topography. And I'm not going to check the chat as we go, but if there's something that comes up, maybe Belinda or Victor or others can just let me know if there's a critical question to answer. Okay. So the reason why, at least I'm so interested in volcanoes in Iceland, is that they share a lot of similarities with volcanoes on other terrestrial planets and moons, and particularly on Mars. This has been a really exciting year for the study of Mars, 3 new spacecraft missions, including a number of countries that haven't participated previously in Mars exploration, including the United Arab Emirates and China as well. Shown here is one of the first images from the UAE's HOPE spacecraft showing Mars. The terminator is basically the shadowed region, and just to the east of that, you can see the Tharsis Montes. And just on the terminator, faint, unless you know where to look, is Olympus Mons shown here, which is the largest volcano in the solar system at about 26 kilometers in height. To give a relative sense of scale for those in the States, it's about the same area as Arizona, and very close in size to actually the area of France as well. I've actually heard it described that if you were to stand at the bottom, you wouldn't really see too much because the volcano is so large that the peak would be over the horizon given the smaller diameter and curvature of Mars. So these large volcanoes tend to receive a lot of attention on Mars, but there are actually a number of other volcanic systems outside of Tharsis, which is where we saw Olympus Mons and Tharsis Montes. Elysium Planitia, which I could probably talk about as nauseum. It's my favorite volcanic system on Mars. But there's actually another one that's located near the new landing site for the Mars 2020 mission. It's called Syrtis Major. Nili Patera includes a lot of volcanic deposits as well. And so while the primary focus of the Mars 2020 mission is to investigate Jezero Crater as an example of a potential older lake on Mars, there is the suggestion, I think confirmed already now by observations, that there is some volcanic history represented there as well. So for those of you that have been tuning along, February 18th was a really exciting day. That was when Mars 2020 began its specific descent through the atmosphere, landing in the edge of Isidis Basin near the northeastern edge of Syrtis Major and southeast of Nili Fosse. This was an image that was snapped by the Mars Reconnaissance Orbiter, specifically HiRISE, which is an instrument run out of my home institution of the University of Arizona, where you can see the parachute and the heat shield for the Mars 2020 rover shown here. And embedded in that parachute, for those that didn't see, was a little nod to the location of the JPL that manufactured this system, including the really fantastic entry, descent, and landing system, including the sky crane. So these are the first images that came back from the Martian surface. So you can see it's relatively sandy. It looks actually a lot like the Icelandic highland. There are a few little rocks and boulders that are kicked out by impact events. It actually landed on this relatively low albedo, which means a relatively bright surface surrounded by a relatively dark material. This dark material has the signature of mafic rocks, which are basically like basaltic lava flows. And so the word in Hawaiian for this would be a kapuka. It's an island surrounded by lava. And so that's where the Mars 2020 has begun its journey. Most recently, I've been particularly excited about the helicopter. The Mars helicopter was added to the overall mission payload as a technology demonstration. It has been upgraded after completing its 4th successful flight to a science operations demonstration, and just managed to conduct a 5th flight that positioned it from a takeoff location to a new location to begin its leapfrog journey as a companion and scout for Mars 2020. And this somewhat odd-looking insect thing is the shadow of the two 1.8 meter or 1.2 meter blades on Ingenuity, casting their shadow on the surface, and the overall weight of the system is about 1.8 kilograms. So it's really quite a fantastic achievement to demonstrating flight for the first time on another planet. Really a fantastic and exciting development. And actually very similar to the work that we're doing. Actually, before the Mars 2020 mission had the addition of a Mars helicopter demonstration. We've been working with folks at JPL to analyze the Holohernes region, shown here on the right, as an analog for studying terrains on Mars, and shown on the left is actually Jezero Crater. For this project, which we call RAVEN, so it's the Rover Aerial Vehicle Exploration Network, our idea was if we could improve the science operational efficiency and science return for future Mars missions using a drone in tandem with a rover, has in part been realized by the Mars 2020 mission, but our project is specifically geared to send these two systems, the Canadian Space Agency's Mars Exploration Science Rover, and a variety of different drones, which include, shown here, a claw, the Raven Claw instrument. We also have a UAV-based drill, hyperspectral imagers, LiDAR images. We have all these different tools that we'll be testing to see which provides the best improvement on the operation of a fully analogous Mars rover in the Icelandic highland. So much of my time this year has actually been spent making sure that stakeholders interested, including the Vatnajökull National Park, the new visitor center at Mývatn, new university partners such as the University, not just of Iceland, but also University of Reykjavik are engaged. I'll be heading up to Mývatn to meet with a number of students at the schools there before it goes out for the semester, to be able to help explain why their part of Iceland is of interest to the international community as a fundamentally important Mars analog location. And so this has been brewing in the background a fair bit. This sort of shows some of our scoop designs. The CSA, Canadian Space Agency headquarters last year, negotiating some of the loan agreements for the rover. It's quite a big beast. This is something that hopefully over the next couple of years, beginning next year, we'll be bringing out our team of 20 people. And in the end of the summer, we'll have the Mars, this rover, delivered from the Canadian Space Agency to Iceland, and the University of Reykjavik will be hosting it for the first year to get students excited about robotics. So in terms of the specific Fulbright objectives, I had 3, all of which were exceptionally difficult to realize if you don't get your field season to collect the data that you need. So the first focus was looking at the Holuhraun eruption, but specifically coupling the mapping that we've been doing using remote sensing data, using drone-based images, as well as data collected from analogous instrumentation from European colleagues, such as DLR, the German Aerospace Center, that has an analog instrument for HRSC, which is a satellite camera in orbit around Mars and Mars Express. So we wanted to tie our observations that we've been making increasingly with the firsthand knowledge that came from the people in Iceland who were able to go into the field from the start of the eruption, which was late August 2014, through to near its completion in February 2015. So that was sort of task 1. Task 2 was focusing on the potential implications for the lava-induced hydrothermal systems. So shown here is the Holuhraun lava on the left, and it inundated a river system, which then developed a hot spring system. And so we have been visiting that on a number of years and sampling it to understand what types of microbial ecologies developed in response to this heating event, how that microbial community has changed as the system has cooled down, and what biomarkers have been left in the geologic record that could help us to understand what to look for if we're sending a comparable mission to a volcanic terrain on Mars to be able to identify signs of habitability. So that was our second project. The third one was focused on an area. This is showing Laki, my absolute favorite of all eruptions in Iceland. There's a fissure that actually has a section in the northeast that's very difficult to access, and in fact wasn't even known to exist until recently. With the retreat of the glacier, the northeastern end has emerged from the coverage of ice. This is showing 1998, 2016. I have actually gone back to air photos from the 1946, and that there is a little bit of evidence that this first part was sticking out then. So this is basically a time capsule of a subglacial fissure segment that was erupted under a section of the Vatnajökull glacier. And so this newly exposed fissure provides an opportunity to see what's happening beneath the ice when we have subglacial eruptions in Iceland, which also occur in other parts of the world, Antarctica, and on other planetary surfaces as well, such as some of the glacial deposits associated with the Olympus Mons and other large volcanoes. So the idea was to go up there and image this time capsule for the first time. So what have we been able to do so far in response to these 4 tasks? The first task of studying the Holuhraun eruption and linkage with observed surface features and eyewitness activities has been quite successful. We've been mainly using previously acquired data, but have been able to move a series of papers through. Basically, you'll see a long list of names that aren't me, but these are basically students and postdocs. So Joanna, who is one of my graduate students, has been doing a fantastic job on this, and we've been able to really push through 3 of the papers that dealt with this. The first one has now been accepted, looking at the highest resolution geomorphological map to date, 1 to 800 scale for Holuhraun, which is now accepted in the Journal of Volcanology and Geothermal Research. She has another paper looking at surface roughness and radar properties in the Bulletin of Volcanology that has been submitted, reviewed, and now is in revision. We have another one looking at the trade-off between whether or not magma-induced seismicity or seismicity-induced magma transport for the Holuhraun eruption, which is now in revision with geology, which is actually, for those that are familiar with the journal, a pretty good one in our field. Joanna has a third paper. She's very productive for a third-year graduate student. that is in review now with geology, combining the observations, both satellite and ground-based, for the time average discharge rate or the effusion rate for Holofernes with different eruption phases. So 4 papers working their way through for task 1. Task 2, we weren't able to acquire new samples, but we have been working with a number of colleagues at the University of Iceland and have been able to finish the data analysis and interpretation for the microbial samples that we had previously acquired. Some had gone back to Arizona, some went to Columbia University, and a lot went into a freezer at the University of Arizona. So we've done a lot of work being able to now understand the genetic characteristics through gene sequencing of the different microbes that we've seen, and identified the thermophile species, the relationship between the hot springs and endospore formers, so these basically durable shells that can be used to protect microbes when climate or environmental conditions change from what they're used to what they can't handle, but potentially be reanimated later on. And also the identification of a new species, endemic or unique to the Holofernes area that hadn't been previously identified. So that one is now in review with astrobiology. So I think that even though I wasn't able to collect the field observations, these areas in the highlands aren't accessible. Basically, I came in January at that time of year, but I think we've been able to make good progress. The last task about looking at Laki, unfortunately, will be impossible. The area is very difficult to access in the highlands in the summer and even into August and early September. It's simply too wet in this proglacial, or this area in front of the glaciers. You just sink in with your trucks. And so you really have to go just as things are starting to freeze, but before there's too much snow. So it's late September, early October. So 2 out of 3 isn't bad. Fortunately, in terms of the best laid plans, there has been a change of direction. And so the really exciting thing that, at least for me, and for many others interested in volcanoes and beautiful landscapes, has been the development of a new earthquake swarm, as well as an eruption. So when the earthquake swarm began, we had tens of thousands of earthquakes, which were interesting, and those of you in Reykjavik probably felt a number of them. But the really exciting activity, at least for me, happened on March 3rd, when the first identification of volcanic tremor began, and that's a signal that magma was moving. And so from the seismic information, we knew that the magma was reaching the surface, and combining seismic and deformation modeling from INSAR, it's a radar technique. The ground was showing deformation that indicated the magma was about 1 kilometer from the surface. I immediately put together a proposal to the National Science Foundation to do a rapid response to the event. And 4 days before the eruption, it was actually the evening when we last met last time, when I nipped out, we had the proposal selected. And so have had additional funding to be able to bring students out and to be able to contribute to the monitoring and collection of data to enable new forms of science. So before the eruption, we went out like crazy with different drones, imaging the area that all the different valleys that we thought may be inundated, mapping out the fault scars that were produced on the surface that even after a single rain would be removed from the geologic record. And we've been seeing that since the onset of the eruption, the effusion rate, or this is basically the time averaged discharge rate, the TADR, which was an important parameter for Holofernes, has been about 5.6 cubic meters per second. And the magma is coming from about 16, 17 kilometers depth. The activity reached having 8 active vents at once, but it's focused down to just a single vent with some very spectacular fountains, some on the order of 400 meters high. The one, I believe, that occurred on early Sunday morning may have been a little bit higher. We're still determining exactly how high it moved out of the frame of a lot of the time-lapse cameras we had. So just to give you a highlight of a couple of details here, I'm just going to check my time. All right, so 16 or so minutes, so we're good. So one of the really cool things about this eruption is that in working with colleagues here at the university, we had a plan. And I visited most of the valleys doing these pre-eruption surveys, and so we knew exactly where to be able to get to. So the eruption started at 8:45, March 19th. And so we were basically by midnight down here by the road around this section, sent out a drone, was able to send it in. This is about 5 or 6 kilometers. The drone range is about 6 kilometers. We were just able to do it, and identified the location of the fissure, the estimate of the effusion rate, its overall length. And in fact, this was on the morning of the 20th, the flow inundation map that we generated. So this is Geldingadeller right here. It's flowing a little bit. This is where some of the hiking trails came in. This is the valley with no name. This is Miradeller. This is basically a snapshot exactly of where we are in the eruption now. This is the maximum length that the lava could travel given the cooling limitation that it has. And it can travel further if it develops in insulated lava pathways like lava tubes. But I think we were actually quite close to being spot on with the predictions. So I was able to go out right away with the eruption, the second Coast Guard helicopter that came out, bring some laser scanning equipment to be able to begin developing the first 3-dimensional models of what the eruption looked like. This is me on the first day. It was nice. There weren't too many people around. Unfortunately, this particular instrument is fantastic. It actually has a 6-kilometer range. It's used a lot for glaciology. It's not an eye-safe laser. And so we were able to beat the crowds with the helicopter for the Coast Guard. But since then, we've had to use different tools. I don't want to be responsible for blinding a significant fraction of the Icelandic population looking at the volcano. So we've tried a bunch of different tools. I've been using handheld laser scanners, not shown here, but we had this is Joanna, one of my students, and Michael Christofferson, a laboratory technician for my group that came out. We actually managed to procure a new drone that's in the Tree 600 and install a ground penetrating radar onto the system, and obtained the first drone-based GPR measurements of active lava flows and lava channels. So we're still processing through that data to see what it's like. We've been collecting samples before the eruption and as the eruption progresses, to be able to understand what the initial microbial ecology was in the area. In fact, sampling areas that are now buried by lava in a pristine state. And we've set up a number of little quarantined areas where we're monitoring the ecological development in terms of the colonization of these new lava flows, both to understand that process in Iceland, but also as a planetary analog. Some of you guys may have seen our little squares that we're putting all around. So these are called ground control points, or GCPs. And so we use differential GPS to be able to develop basically millimetric positioning of each of these flags, so that any drone surveys or airborne surveys can use these markers to geo-encode their data. And so we can establish a correspondence between these different data sets. And so we've been sharing this information with the Land Survey in Iceland, with the Natural History, Institute of Natural History, partners at the University of Iceland and others. This is my well-timed truck that I got here, Rollo. A little bit muddy, but it's been doing a great job getting us into the area. And it even from time to time gets a bath. So I just wanted to end with a couple of images. We probably have about 2 terabytes of data that are collected from here. And our process is a little bit different. We're contributing to part of the monitoring effort, but the National Science Foundation mandate is all the data we collect becomes open access. And we're really collecting data to enable specific science questions. We're not monitoring for the sake of monitoring. And so we're collecting a tremendous amount of data, but unfortunately, we will have published data sets, but there won't be publications that come with it. I was given basically 0 time to analyze the data, but I was given some resources to bring out some extra hands. And so our publications from this would be later, but the data sets would be published, and of course acknowledge the time and contributions from the Fulbright Iceland program, which otherwise would make this impossible. It does, the NSF Rapid program covers 0 salary. So I've been out to the volcano at least 30, 35 times, and that was a unique opportunity enabled by not just timing, but also the flexibility of the Fulbright program. So I can't thank the organization enough for that. So this is when the volcano was really cute in the very beginning. This is part of Volcano Disneyland. Unfortunately, it has become a beast since then. Having gone out to the eruption so many times, I was actually there for the opening of 2 fissures. This was my favorite, the fissure 5, which, sorry, fissure 4, which opened up on the hill. And this is pre-drone flight, one of the lava flows that's coming down the hill. I was able to image that also at night. It looks like a very eerie Marsscape with the lava coming down the hill. And in fact, there was so much incandescence that the images we acquired during the evening, we were able to make stereophotogrammetric or full 3-dimensional models from those data. Really beautiful. I'm just showing the stills here, but most of what we're interested in was velocity measurements and trying to relate the cooling history to the transport process, which is science jargon for good data. But the most of those data products go into OpenCV or Open Computer Vision software to track the particles, but these are just images that show some of the beautiful arborous types of structures found in the lava. So then, as the eruption continued, this is fissure 5, or vent 5, and so we were there for the start of this one as well, and it's now become the monster that's feeding the large fire fountains at the moment. Some more breakouts, these really just beautiful pieces of just land in the making. This is Joanna and I earlier on in the eruption looking at some of the spiny lava, which was characteristic of the Holuhraun eruption quite a bit using our drones. And this is an example of one of the partnerships with the Institute of Natural History. So we set up around all throughout this area, these little tiny white, black and white checkered flags that geoencode this area. This is showing the fissures when we had multiple ones that were active, feeding initially into the valley with no name. And so this is a full 3-dimensional model. It has a digital elevation model, orthomosaic, and we've been generating these every few days for the time series evolution of the lava. Most recently, you've probably seen, maybe some of you from Reykjavik, especially if you go up to the top of Perlan, can see the glow of these increasingly high fountains. Basically, the fissures, which as I mentioned, reached a maximum of 8 vents, have focused down to 1, and it's as though you kind of put your thumb on the top of a hose. We have a periodicity feeding these very high fountain events. Rumor has it that some of the highest ones, like that one on Sunday, may have reached about half a kilometer, but this was just a run-of-the-mill one from yesterday. And yeah, so it's ended up with a couple of funny media opportunities. So this one was somewhat entertaining with Anderson Cooper. And I don't know, there's just an excerpt from this. I'm going to see if this works. We might lose the video. Well, I would have to dip to it afterwards. I thought funniest thing about this whole process is they really just wanted to know about the hot dogs. So they were like, but hot dogs, turns out, are really not the best thing to put onto the lava, in large part because they're little bits of glass that get onto everything. And so the recommendation we have is to use burritos instead. I could put the link in the chat too. Yeah, I'll do that afterwards. There's a full 12-minute version, but I'll just put the part about the burritos. That's all people really care about. And so let's see. Oh dear. I think it is trying to do something in the background, and it's not letting me go to my last slide. So I will try stop sharing and move to the last slide. Something in the background is adamant that it wants to play and not my presentation. So.
Okay, do you think you're gonna get the last slide or should we skip it? You tell us.
I think we can skip it. I'm going to try one last thing, which is closing the browser. And if that doesn't work, it's just fine. Yeah. I knew it was brave to try and put a link into the chat, into a presentation, but let's see. Yeah, okay, we'll have to end it with this. I had a sort of a video to be able to play more in the background than anything else, just of one of the full cycles of the this particular phase of activity, which was intended just as a backdrop for a Q&A with the time we had left. So I'll just end here.
All right. Our next presentation is Dr. Skylar Bayer. She's a marine biologist and a fellow at the University of Maine. Skylar only arrived this morning, so she is a real trooper. I actually offered her to, do a presentation at a later date, but she was ready to roll up her sleeves and just dive right in. So it's pretty impressive. She's affiliated with the Marine and Freshwater Research Institute here, and I know that they're very glad to have her. She's working on a project related to the Icelandic scallop population, which is a commercially important subarctic species. So I hope you were able to get a little bit of rest this morning, Skylar. We'd love to hear about your work and what you intend to do here.
Thank you. Let's see if I can share my screen. Is that working? You guys see it? All right, let me see if I can get it to presenter mode. Does that look like presenter mode? I think it's taken up the full screen. Okay. So I am just starting today. I have to say it's amazing I'm finally here, and thanks to everyone at the Fulbright Commission for making it happen. I wrote this proposal 3 years ago. So the fact that I'm finally here doing it, it's just for a 3-month project, but I'm really excited because I really hope that this spawns some new collaborations or projects down the road. And when I did apply to the project, I was at University of Maine, but I just started as an assistant professor at Roger Williams University in Rhode Island this fall, which is primarily an undergraduate institute. So I've been mostly teaching on Zoom for the past year and not seeing anyone. And then I got my vaccination and got on a plane and came here. So I just want to explain a little bit more about my perspective on things, because I do have a big background in science communication, which is why a lot of my slides look like comics. But some of my background and interests, I consider classic science communication to overlap, at least in my world, with my love of invertebrate biology and ecology. I think invertebrates are the best, and I think ecology is the best thing ever. In fact, I try to apply a lot of ecology principles to people very frequently, whether or not it applies. And then I find that overlaps with human communication and connection. I do a lot of engagement with my job, and my position basically requires it in the shellfish world. So that's fisheries and aquaculture, and that requires human communication and connection as well as dealing with harvesters and growers and liking shellfish and the people that grow them. And then my research interests really fall between my love of invertebrate biology and ecology, especially with bivalves, and then what shellfish people do, whether they fish them or culture them. And finally, I just want to point out that a lot of how research management practices and policy really gets done into something that's actionable really falls between these three circles I have here. And I worked in DC for Congress for a year, and I learned a lot about this little part there, and really my new job falls into that. So I just want to explain that sort of the perspective I'm coming from starting this project, and I'm really excited that I get to focus really on research that I think later on can be brought to a broader community. But because I know everyone has a wide variety of backgrounds and specialties, and I'm really bummed I missed a bunch of it this morning. It looked really interesting. I'm just going to explain what an Iceland scallop is. the PR person at my school didn't even know that scallops existed in Iceland. So I don't take it for granted that people know what they are, but Klamath Icelandica is the Latin name. This is a beautiful drawing. I can't find the original artist for this, but of both the shell and the interior. And they're a filter feeder. They're bivalves. They're two-shelled mollusk, if you're not familiar with the taxonomy, and they feed on plankton and other things in the water column. And they can be really colorful. This is a black and white picture, but it shows like there's a lot of variation in intensity of color. And they have a preferred depth of 10 to 100 meters. They're pretty sensitive to temperature, and they tend to attach themselves to rocks and other substrates on the benthos. They typically live on hard seafloors, and there's sand and gravel and shell fragments. And these little blue arrows show in this screenshot here, which is from a GoPro camera survey. And if you're interested in looking at some of these surveys, I can drop these links in the chat afterwards. But these are some of the Icelandic clams on the seafloor, as well as some of the other animals in the environment. I see there's a bunch of chat here. Oh, thing. Welcome. Okay. In terms of the sex, so my background is predominantly in reproductive biology of sea scallops, which are on the east coast of the US. So this is a subject I like to talk about a lot. And Iceland scallops usually have separate sexes, but occasionally you can find hermaphrodites, and usually they reach sexual maturity around 5 to 7 years. This is a dissection of one, and this big orange part, that's the gonad. And as you can see, when it's ripe, it's a pretty big portion of their body. Usually they grow to 6.5 to 8.5 centimeters in shell height, although I've read that the largest found is 16 centimeters and the oldest is 23 years, but I'm sure there's some variation around that. And they're broadcast spawners, which means their sperm and egg are released and meet in the water column. And that's actually true for a lot of marine species, although the exact count, as far as I know, is unknown. And this is a GIF I made of a male sea scallop, not an Icelandic scallop, spawning, just to give you an idea of, you can just barely see these wisps coming out, but that also tells you that in dark water, it'd be really hard to see these things spawning if you were to try to watch them and catch them in the act. For Iceland scallops, spawning typically is at the end of June through the end of July. And in terms of their life history, which is really the focus of this project, this is a schematic that's probably for a bay scallop that's common on the east coast of the US, but here you have the adults, they spawn and their eggs and sperm meet in the water column, and then they develop into these different larval stages. And until they settle on substrate, at this point, they're called spat. They're newly settled juveniles. They grow, they get bigger, and eventually become adults. But between spawning and when they settle, in a lot of species, not just scallops, it can be a bit of a mystery what's going on here, where they go, how they're influenced by things like temperature, tides, whatever. People have been trying to do research for decades, but in general, it's kind of a big black box, and we often call it a big black box in marine ecology. But we can get pieces of information related to these stages. We can look at gonad indices, what proportion of the body weight is gonad in adults to figure out when they might be spawning. We can collect spat in different places and see how much there are and when and where they're settling. And then we can count how many juveniles or adults, depending how we define the word recruit, how they're recruiting to the population. And then we can count adults. And then we can we can try to figure out what's going on here with those pieces of information. Also, I'd be remiss not to mention that one of the reasons we even care about them is that they're very delicious and very sweet and have an excellent texture. And my colleague here in Iceland has told me they're the best scallops of all the scallops. There's an international scallop meeting we have every few years, and he claims that they're the absolute best. And I took this image from an Icelandic news site that has a nice recipe that I want to try eventually, if you're interested. But they're a delicacy, and there have been in the past a big fishery here and then in lots of other places in the subarctic. So this map gives you an idea, at least in the North Atlantic where they are. Red usually indicates a higher intensity of them, and yellow is sort of the range where you might find them or they have expanded to. It's kind of an estimate based on this Aquamaps app. But in the Northwest Atlantic, they're on the western side of Greenland from Thule to Cape Farewell, Hudson Bay to Nova Scotia, which is in Canada. And sometimes you can find them as far south as Cape Cod. In the Northeast Atlantic, southwestern Kara Sea, the White Sea, Svalbard, Bjornoa. I don't know where actually all these places are very well, but I do know the western coast of Norway, and then most of Iceland, except for part of the south coast, is where they've been found. And that's the part we really care about, right? So the scallop, the scallop fishery in Iceland on a commercial scale started in 1969. And it hit its peak around 1985. They brought in 17,000 metric tons of them that year. And then it started to decrease. And I have a figure on the next slide that demonstrates this. And in the 90s, they were catching around 8,000 to 9,000 tons per year. And overall, before the fishery closed in 2004, there were 254,000 metric tons total, which I've done some estimates. I know it's around $7 million a year, at least towards the end. And I believe it's like 868.35 million Iceland kroner per year. And it depends who you ask, though. This number shifts a little bit, but that gives you an idea that it was worth a lot. And the Breidafjordur Bay in West Iceland had the largest population. It made up 85% of the cumulative catch right here. And so that's really where a lot of the efforts have been to understand the dynamics going on and really trying to figure out how to potentially bring the fishery back if that is possible. So a little bit more about the bay. From 2000 to 2003, the stock size of the scallop population there dropped by 70%. And so this black line is the biomass index, the total there, and you can see just this huge drop off here. The red line's catch per unit effort. So you can see that in the 90s, they were trying really hard to fish really hard, and they fished them really hard. And then the population really dropped off from 8,600 to 800 metric tons. And so it was closed in 2004. And there's been an experimental fishery that was opened in 2014 that's very limited. This gives you an idea visually, I think, of what those catches were. The red here indicates total catch in the bay, and then blue is all the other areas. So you can see it made up such a huge portion of the catch coming in. And you can see in 2003 that huge decline. And then here is when an experimental fishery opened up in 2014 up until 2019. And the amount that's being harvested or advised to be harvested from the Marine and Freshwater Research Institute is very, very minimal compared to the heyday. Just to give you an idea visually of where the experimental fishery is, these are a few of these grids indicate where they've started, or sorry, where they have been for the last few years doing experiments. And they've been doing surveys with the fishermen in these areas, and then the little bit of harvesting that you see in those data. So what caused the collapse? There's a couple pieces of information that the managers were able to pull together to sort of understand what probably happened, but there were only a few year classes in the stock. So you weren't relying on multiple year classes that were reproducing. There was low recruitment, so not many new adults coming into the population. over a couple years. Then there was the protozoan parasite that caused high mortality in the population. The water was a bit warmer that year. And then there were low levels of phytoplankton. And so the disease from the parasites and these stressful conditions right above led to poor body condition with smaller mussels. So that's the part that most folks eat, and gonads. And some folks eat the gonads too, but also if you have smaller gonads, you can't produce as many babies, which lowers your recruitment. And then also the fishing pressure was pretty high. So you combine all this and you end up with a collapse, like the cards that I have there. So since the collapse, there's been monitoring from MRFI, and I just took a little screenshot to show. I'm in Reykjavik right now, but I'll be taking the bus down here. I think Jonas is actually giving me a ride this week. Make sure I can figure out how to get there. And I know they used to be based in Reykjavik. They would have been based in Reykjavik, I think, if I came like when I originally proposed to come. Anyway, if you're not familiar with them, they're a government institute here, and they conduct research and provide scientific advice based on that research for fisheries. And it's the result of a 2016 merger of two research institutes, the Institute of Freshwater Fisheries and the Marine Research Institute, that were formed in the 40s and 60s. And in terms of the Iceland scallop data collection, Jonas Jonasson, who's my collaborator for this proposal, has been leading a lot of this data collection since 2011. And before that, for his master's work, he wrote a couple of papers on the Iceland scallop populations. So in terms of data that they've been collecting, and this is beyond just since the collapse, but before then, in some for some of these data, there are time series of the meat and gonad condition. And so what that means is if you look at condition of at least the meats, you see a normal healthy scallop has this size meats, and a scallop of the same size that's diseased has these small brown, sometimes gray, shrunken mussels. And then we can see in this histology here, cluster the parasites that's causing this. So there's at least 10 years, 11 years of data from the first part of 2000, and then they've done some more surveys, I think, in 2019. And they've been collecting larval and spat collection, or they've done larval and spat collection from 2005 to 2019, which is a really important point of the work I propose to do. They've also done annual fishery and recruitment surveys for a long time, since the 90s. And again, recruitment indices are how, measuring how new adults are added to the population. And then there's sea surface temperature records that have been recorded since the 1990s. And I don't have it on here, but there might be some data on the currents as well. So these are relatively large data sets, and as from the perspective of an ecologist, I find them really fascinating because long-term data sets going to the same places over and over again is relatively rare overall, and especially at such a small scale. A lot of fisheries I'm familiar with are at much more larger geographical scales, and so the resolution you're getting is not as good as, say, here in Iceland. Looking at this one bay, it's large, but it's relatively, from my perspective, not an overwhelmingly large piece of water. And one of the problems, right, with collecting data all the time as a fishery scientist is you don't always have time to do a lot of in-depth analysis. You kind of have to have a lot of time or people to help do all that analysis and write the papers, because collecting data and going to sea all the time is a lot of work and takes up a lot of time. And this is where I'm coming in to be here for 3 months to help do all this data analysis. And so it's really a great opportunity to analyze for predictive relationships potentially. We have information on gonad conditions, so we can look at spawning from that perspective. We have a spat data series, which is really great. Not a lot of fisheries necessarily have that. And then we have all this recruit information. And so we can start to think about, are there relationships over time? We see peak gonad conditioning, it might indicate spawning, and the timing of spawning can help us predict when to expect spat. Over here on the right side is some diagrams from my work, from my PhD work, looking at gonad indices of sea scallops for females and males. And you can see that there's this peak in gonad index and then a decline for these two different sites. And it tends to be associated with temperature. And so it's just sort of a sample to give you an idea of the kind of thinking when I'm talking about time series and how it can help predict spat settlement. If you generally know how long the larvae are supposed to be in the water, you can kind of come up with an estimate of when you'd expect to see spat. And then we can also see how that correlates with changes in temperature or other environmental factors we're interested in. And then variation over space, we might be able to see differences over space in that peak gonad condition and where spawning occurs. Maybe we can predict where to expect spat fall, either with oceanographic currents we know about or patterns we've seen. There could be temperature influences. And this is just a sample map to show you what I mean by spatial. This is a heat map of natural mortality variation in the bay from previous work that Jonas has done. But you can see that there's certain areas that have a lot more mortality than others. So those kinds of maps or products that I'm interested in producing, analyzing these data. Finally, it's really an opportunity to analyze for predictive relationships with recruitments. Recruitment is a huge problem in fisheries. Usually the number of adults does not predict recruitment number of children very well, especially with scallops. It's a consistent problem. And so other folks have suggested that spat biomass really needs to be the thing that predicts recruits. And more recently, a bunch of invertebrate fisheries in Australia found that the pre-recruit stage was really important for the predictor of catch, or the adults that you're going to harvest, more than the recruits. So my proposed research really has two major objectives. This is from my original proposal, and I expect them to kind of like shift a little bit the more we get into the data, but I want to identify spatial and temporal relationships between the spawning adults and spat in the bay, and then determine if gonad indices, spat biomass, or temperature are associated with the presence recruits, or really are strong predictors of recruitment. And I'm going to be working with MFRI and Jonassen. He's been overseeing these collection for years and really knows the data well. And he's been a great mentor and collaborator already, and he helped me get here. And so for objective 1, it's going to be a lot of analysis focused on temporal patterns of the gonad condition and the spat abundance. And I haven't worked out all of the analyses just yet. I kind of want to look at the data first, but I want to see if there's a strong correlation to begin with, especially in different areas of the bay. And then in terms of recruitment, this proposal is an opportunity for me to move beyond traditional ANOVA statistical methods and dive more into generalized linear mixed models if they do prove to be more appropriate for these kinds of problems. After working with some friends who do fisheries ecology, it seems like a really good direction to go in. And so temperature is probably going to play a huge part in that as well, from what I've read of Iceland scallops so far. And then in terms of the spatial relationships, which is going to be a bit more complicated, there are some spatial statistics that I could do, but I'm also wondering if it would be wise to eventually involve like an oceanographic modeler, since currents are probably going to come into play here. In terms of long-term ideas and hopes for collaboration, I know I just got here, but I do think these kinds of analyses are really helpful. Looking, when you look at the whole life cycle history, I said that that black box is really important. It's going to be relevant to fisheries data management, both in Iceland and the US. Jonas and I have already talked a lot about wanting to share this information with the public. Perhaps it'll spawn future projects. But it could be really relevant to fishermen. I know that aquaculturists in at least Canada have started culturing Iceland scallops, and I think I've read one master's thesis about if it's possible in Iceland. I also do work with eDNA to detect spawning events and larval supply back at my home institution, and it'd be cool if we could do something like that here with Iceland scallops. And then finally, because I just started teaching at Roger Williams, I'd love to bring students back here at some point for short courses. There's a lot of enthusiasm in my department for it, so that might be something in the future. So that's all I have for today. So thank you for listening.